welcome to History is Sexy episode 2.
Welcome also to you to History episode, right? No. To History
is it too sexy for you?
It's way too sexy for me in my current mental state.
So, I'm Emma, and I'm a historian.
I am Janina, and I am not so much that.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Neither of us know anything really about what we're talking about today, so it doesn't really matter.
I learned about what we're talking about today in high school as a prelude to something else.
I see, I never learned about it. I only did Between the Wars, so we did 1918 to 1939.
Right.
And skipped the interesting bits.
Great.
What some might call.
See, I did the module, I think it was called at the time, that I did was the causes of World War II. So
yes.
Because
so
World
Between
War
the
One
Wars
was one of the causes, so we looked a little bit at World War One, but only as a leading point.
Yeah, you could have basically called Between the Wars the causes of World War II. But no one ever taught me the causes of World War One. And until fairly recently, virtually everything I knew about World War One came from the 4th series of Blackadder.
That is fair. I also had the books of Bodie Taney, which started in World War One, and I don't recommend them. She's like a Christian romance novelist. You're not, they're very, what they are about based on that statement.
Yeah.
And in addition, I knew about World War One from the last book in the Anne of Green Gables series, Rilla of Ingleside, which is set during World War One.
So a lot more than me, really, because mine was just Blackadder in a trench.
I feel like that's probably the best.
Yeah.
Blackadder is always the best teacher.
He is. He taught me everything I never needed to know about the Tudors and the Plantagenets. Are they Plantagenets? And the George III and also World War One. I knew all of British history right there. Don't need to know anything more.
You literally don't.
No. So we're talking about World War One today because I finally got around to watching Wonder Woman a solid year after everybody else, and it discovered that it has a really weird portrayal of World War One in that rather than considering what World War One was actually about, they just seem to have the Germans be Nazis who own slaves and are evilly creating evil gases with a kind of masked evil lady, and the British are kind of stiff upper-lipped and all called Sir Patrick something, or are working class Tommies in a trench being terribly desperately trying to help those poor people.
Yeah, just getting down to it, what needs to be done, because we're British.
Yeah, and this infuriated my partner so much that he refused to watch the rest of it because he actually knows about things. But it was just kind of interesting to me in that I felt that it was an interesting visual shorthand, so we knew who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, to have the bad guys be Nazis basically, and to use a lot of World War II imagery in World War One.
Yeah.
And if I knew anything about World War One, it was that it was not Nazis.
Yes, the Nazis weren't invented yet in World War One.
They were not. As we both know from Between the Wars, they were potentially a result of, but they were not yet invented.
It is an interesting thing that happens in Wonder Woman, and this is going to mildly spoil it a little bit, for which I'm sorry. Yeah. Or you can skip forward a minute or two if you've not seen it and you want to. Because it does try to interrogate that a little bit, because the premise of the movie is that Wonder Woman has grown up on her Greek island, beautiful Themyscira, I think it's called, her little paradise, being told that war is always caused by Ares, the god of war, and what he does is he finds a nation and he poisons them against another nation, and they become the evil army that is being manipulated by Ares. And the good people have to fight them off. And that's what she believes that war is, that there is always an evil side and always a good one. And that's the attitude that she carries into World War One when she comes across it, which is sort of confirmed by the way that Steve, Trevor, the American soldier she meets, talks about it, and the British soldier she comes across talk about it as the Germans must be defeated because they're evil and they're doing evil things. But at the end of the movie, she meets up with Ares and finds he was actually one of the British men.
He is actually a diplomat.
And what he says to her is, I never have to do anything to make people war. They just do it.
Yeah.
And all I do is tiny little changes to push them a little bit further in one way or another, but they're always going to fight because that's what people do. And they could have interrogated properly at this point, but then they just had a boss fight, which I think was a real shame. Yes. And they never really faces up to the fact that the German soldiers they've been fighting are also just people.
Yeah, and I do think this is one of those things with comic book movies and why you should never rely on comic book movies to like they're not there to teach you anything. But
which doesn't mean they can't.
Yeah, it doesn't mean they don't have a certain amount of ethical responsibility to attempt to not massively misrepresent stuff. But
and to be fair, Thor Ragnarok did make some pretty powerful comments on colonialism and whitewashing history and
absolutely
in the middle of all the fun and laughs.
Yeah, and one of her experiences when she goes into the trenches, and this was the point at which Connor lost his mind, was when she goes into the trenches and everyone is kind of on the British side is very injured and sad, and there's a poor civilian woman of non-specific nationality going, they're taking slaves on the other side, and then she goes, we have to go and help these people by just destroying the German soldiers who are therefore portrayed as inexplicably slave owning and just causing damage and not taking any.
Yeah.
And so revealing that actually the bad guy is the British guy doesn't really undermine that. Like you've already set that up that all of the Germans are somehow.
No.
And this is not something necessarily that, because we've now done looked at a lot of British propaganda about the Germans, and I feel like a lot of British propagandists of the 1910s would probably have got along with Wonder Woman very well and been like, yeah, no, they are fundamentally evil in every way.
This is the thing, because it's not just Wonder Woman, is it? Like, this is a common thing when people think about these wars. The Germans were bad.
The Germans were the bad guys and they started
a war. The rest of the allies were good and heroes, and sort of the European allies were like the weak and had to be protected. And that's how we picture it, and it's interesting to look at why that has happened in the first place and why it has so palpably continued to now.
And it is a very strong Germany were the bad guys with capital B, capital G.
Yeah.
And in reading a lot of different accounts, because the accounts of how World War One began are very, very long, very, very detailed, and they all tend to have a slightly different emphasis on whose eventual fault it was. But I read quite a few which were basically blaming it all on Germany, and they were almost all American. Essentially blaming it all on the idea that Germany was causing a problem, and if Germany hadn't existed, then everything probably would have been fine. Which was quite interesting in that it is putting all of the blame on one power amongst about 5 massive powers who all had to be involved for World War One to start.
Yes.
So shall we talk a little bit through, as quickly as is humanly possible, because fuck me, Janina, it is boring.
It's very, very boring.
As it turns out, the reason that nobody has ever taught why World War One started is because you could essentially keep going back for as long as you want to see when the beginning is. So you could keep going back to and then in 1640, there was a war between the French and the English. And also because there's about 400 very complicated diplomatic issues between 5 great powers. And it's unbearably tedious.
Yeah, it's really, really boring.
It's boring and complicated, the 2 worst things.
Yeah, so in the broadest of brushstrokes, because let's get past it, because it sucks.
Okay, broadest of brushstrokes. Being fully aware that we are overlooking a myriad complex issues to do with all kinds of different problems. Look somewhere else if you want something that gets into all details. It's
not what we're here for. That's not sexy.
It's not sexy, it's boring. Right, in 2 minutes, Janina, go.
So basically in the few hundred years before this, Europe had been very tumultuous, going from tiny little micro-governments and city-states and things to becoming nations, and there was a lot of tension between the idea of ethnic nationalism and geographical nationalism, which ended up with borders being drawn in places where people did not want them to be drawn. Including
the emergence of Germany as a country from what was originally the state of Prussia, and then Germany, led almost single-handedly by Bismarck, fought and diplomacied its way into creating the country of Germany as we now know it, by stealing bits from Austria and stealing bits from elsewhere, and eventually stealing Alsace-Lorraine from France in a war, and created Germany as a country which had never previously existed and was now a super powerful, quite big country that had pissed everyone around it off.
Mm-hmm. But had some pretty key alliances as well. So then we get to a point, because another one of these borders which wasn't super great for everyone was Austria-Hungary, which involved a Serbian population that were kind of shat on.
Yeah, Austria-Hungary is one of those very, very, very old empires which used to be incredibly powerful and ruled, pretty much been in charge of Europe for a long time, and has now interbred itself into, not like everyone has severe mental health problems, and a lot of people have quite severe physical problems as a result of some very small gene pools. And they are primarily concerned with their own business and have failed to rule their empire properly for a long time. They're mostly getting involved in like wild murder-suicides and just trying to steal children from each other and murdering each other. It's all quite good fun, but what they're not doing is paying attention to their ethnic and nationalist crises that are occurring within what are technically their borders.
Yeah, so then we get Serbia wanting to liberate Slavs from Austria-Hungary, and one of them hit on the plot to assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand to aggravate Austria into paying attention to them, basically.
Which, I mean, did work.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what happens is that then everybody, and it seems like a lot of European powers, because you've got Russia, who is a massive power, you've got Austria-Hungary, who are still technically a power, you've got Germany, who are a new power, and who think that they should be as powerful and as good as Britain and France. You have Britain, who have the biggest navy in the whole wide world and are growing towards being the biggest empire that has ever existed. And everybody wants to be the biggest and the best, and therefore sees anybody else having literally anything as being a threat to them. And everybody is kind of itching to take the others down, essentially. On the one hand, they don't want a war because they know it'll be pretty bad, but on the other hand, everybody wants to take everybody else down a peg or two and show how great they are.
Yeah. So when this happens, it kicks off all sorts of negotiations and like threats of war, which are then attempted to be brought down, but basically everyone starts ignoring everyone else's conditions and ultimatums. So the Serbian attempt to negotiate with Austria-Hungary fails, and they declare, I don't actually know who declared war first. One of them does.
It ends up being a war between Russia and Germany.
Well, this is I find really interesting, because we have this bit where Austria-Hungary is in conflict with Serbia, and there's this disagreement within the German administration about whether or not they're going to support Austria-Hungary in this fight.
Yes.
Because basically, King Kaiser Wilhelm was on holiday and didn't get messages fast enough. And by the time he got back, his foreign office was like, yeah, we're at war now. And so his attempts to back out were a little bit too little too late.
Yeah. And then it ends up being Germany kind of backing up Austria-Hungary, what am I talking about? Austria-Hungary, and Russia backing up the Slavs in Serbia, and them going to war. And then Germany makes this bizarre decision that every book I've read just goes, there's no logic in war. And there was no logic in what Germany did next. And they essentially, had it been that, it would have been a war that Britain never would have got involved in, and France probably never would have got involved in. But Germany decided that if they went to war with Russia, because there is an ancient alliance between Russia and France, that France would get involved. So they thought, well, we can't go into Russia if France are going to get involved. So what we'll do is we'll take out France first. So we'll just surprise attack them. But in order to surprise attack France, they have to go across Belgium. And Belgium is just sitting there being like, I'm not having anything to do with this, lads. Like, leave me out of it. I'm not being an alliance with you. I'm not being an alliance with you. I just want to be bureaucratic and have some beer. Like, just leave me be. And Germany's response was, we're just going to cut through. Just nipping through with all of our tanks and all of our big stuff, and if we could just nip through and have a war on your border, that'd be grand. And unfortunately, this was just a bizarre decision, because the one alliance that Belgium has is that if anybody invades them, Britain, with the world's biggest navy and the world's biggest army, will come and support them, which they did. And it's at that point, because then you've got France involved in the war and Britain involved in the war, who also have the hugest colonial empires spread across the world, across just unfathomable swathes of the world, that all of those borders between countries in Africa and Asia then become borders in a war that would not previously have been involved. Mm-hmm. If this had just been between Austria-Hungary, cannot say that, or even just between France and Russia, it would have been a smaller thing. But because you then have enormous empires, then everyone becomes involved.
Yeah, you've got soldiers coming from literally as far away as it's possible for them to be.
Yep.
Namely New Zealand, as well as Canada and Australia and all the colonies in Africa. We've got India as well at this point. So yeah, this is what the British Empire basically dragged the entire world into war.
Pretty much.
Well done.
But yeah, and that's the reason that everybody thinks that the Germans are the bad guys, because the Germans invaded Belgium, who were sitting doing nothing to a nobody. But really, in order to explain it, and I've got books that are about 4 inches thick that go into like the unbearable detail, or you can watch 4-hour YouTube things, which will explain it with maps and things, and they are interminable. But that's like the basics. There was a fight over whether Serbia was part of Austria-Hungary or whether it was allowed to be its own country that escalated wildly. And then, because people then tried to fight it like an old war with kind of ground troops and things, but with new technologies like enormous heavy mobile artillery and gas.
Yeah.
And also things like one of the best, it's not really a narrative, it's first person account, is Stefan Zweig's account of being a part of the First World War. He travelled around on the Eastern Front. He was Austrian. I mean, he travelled around a lot on the Eastern Front on trains, and this is one thing that had never existed in a previous war, was the ability to mobilise massive amounts of troops really quickly in just a matter of days across to a new border, when previously it would have been weeks of marching. Like the reason that the Napoleonic War, which is not dissimilar, in that it's a huge European war that drags on for years. Anytime you wanted to get from one town to another, it takes weeks to march there, and now you can get there in a day on the train. And you also don't have to spend weeks marching backwards and forwards to send a message. If you need to get a message to a general somewhere, you've got the telegraph, which didn't exist before.
So we've got fast travel, fast communication. We've got brutal weapons that can kill a huge amount of people very quickly.
Yeah. And prevent things like old wars. You used to have virtually everything I know about older wars comes from sharp books. But from what I gather from sharp books is that you would use your artillery to just brutalise your enemy into a point where all of their defences had collapsed, and then you marched in, and part of that would be taking out their artillery. But now everybody has enormous heavy artillery, and it has long range artillery, which means that you can now start brutalising your enemy before you even see them, which means that they can never get close enough for anything else to happen. It's just two armies standing really far apart, brutalising each other.
Rather than crawling up with bayonets.
It's why you've got no good hero stories like Sharp from the First World War, because
yeah,
because you know what Sharp did? He had a massive sword and a bayonet, and other people would brutalise, and then he would run in and then just go stab, stab, stab. And then after 4 hours of stabbing, the battle would be over, and one person had lost and one person had won.
But if you don't run, if you stand until you can smell the garlic and fire volley after volley, 3 rounds a minute, then they slow down. They stop. And then they run away. All you've got to do is stand and fire 3 rounds a minute. Now, you and I know you can fire 3 rounds a minute. But can you stand?
And there's absolutely none of that in World War One. You just have a lot of brutalising, and then there'd be a battle, like the Somme, where they'd go, we're going to do one big push and we're just going to brutalise the hell, and then we're going to run at them and we're going to go, come on lads, it's exactly like Napoleon. And they would kind of run in and go, oh, there's still big guns coming at us. We didn't destroy any of those guns at all, which is why everybody died, and it was just horrible.
Yeah, a lot of people died, and this is also the first time, this is a national effort. It's not like you have the military who are mostly, the second son of a gentleman who bought his way into a conscription, because that's how you joined the military in the olden days. You bought your way into a nice officer's position.
Also learnt that from Sharp.
I learned that from Austin.
They're all rubbish in Sharp, because the only good soldiers are those who work their way up through the ranks.
But this war got so out of hand that there was national conscription, and you had ordinary boys being thrown, and I say boys advisedly because a lot of them were 18 years old, often from working class backgrounds, legally obliged to join this war that they had no control over, and then were being commanded, again, by gentlemen who had bought their way into the army.
Yes.
Because that was one of the respectable professions in the olden days.
And this is like one of those, you've got two issues there, which is like the very big change in what the army is as a result of World War One. It stops being a respectable profession that you enter and starts being a profession that is more like being a carpenter or something. It's more of a trade than a profession like a lawyer, which is what it used to be. And also this idea of nationalism, and that is like surprisingly new. It's only been since about 1815 that you've started having nations making agreements with one another instead of having just kings making friends with one another. And then as soon as one king dies, that agreement is out the window and you have to make another agreement with the next king. There's the idea of national borders that are more permanent. And the idea of agreements between, the idea of even a country existing as a thing that then has people within it who all have a shared identity is a relatively new issue in 1914. And this is one of the first times that gets like tested properly in the field of war, where countries are fighting one another rather than the personal armies of kings fighting one another. There's quite a good story, which I want to say it's George IV, who's the king. It's one of the Georges. They're all broadly similar. He's the king of England during World War One, and he was the grandson of Queen Victoria, who is also the grandmother of Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany, who is the cousin of the Tsar in Russia. And she's also related to the Habsburgs, and she was also related through Albert to the Saxe-Coburgs in Belgium, and virtually all of European aristocracy was related to Queen Victoria. She was the grandmother of Europe. And as it was all kicking off, George allegedly turned to his friend and just went, "Grandmother would never have let this happen." Because that's what diplomacy was back in the day. Like, Queen Victoria would, send letters to people and be like, "You absolutely will not." And you had these marital alliances between countries that would stop that from happening, which is why the Habsburgs were so disgustingly interbred, because they married to make sure that power stayed within, and why we had no British queens for a huge amount of time, because they were all French or Belgian, so that we could have an alliance with them, so that the French would never attack us. Exactly. And so you had this was how diplomacy worked, and now that's not what diplomacy is anymore. It's not kings marrying the daughter of somebody else in order to make sure that no war happens. It's nationalism, and it's borders, and it's confusing.
But they do respond to this by trying to make it less confusing for people. And the method they use is mass communication and just basically wall-to-wall manipulation of the public discourse around the war.
They are, well, I mean, I have to say, obviously not the racist bits that we're about to talk about, but I empathise with the decision to try and make it simpler. And just be like, you know what, the Germans are bad guys, this is how bad they are. And be just, there's nothing complicated about this, don't worry about it, lads. It's a moral war. I promise it's a moral war, and the Germans are the bad guys. And the Germans did a very similar thing, where they...
A little less effectively, to the point where a couple of decades later, Hitler was open in how much he respected the British propaganda efforts of World War One. He deliberately tried to mimic them when he was in the early days of the Nazi Party, to obviously great effect, as we know.
Yeah, it's a remarkable skill, whoever they got to do that. You can look at, I mean, we'll put this in the show notes, the kind of examples of propaganda that are, I mean, they're not subtle. In fact, it takes me back to that, there's a Blackadder episode about the propaganda where Blackadder's painting a painting of a terrible German, a terrible Hun who is raped and murdered a nun, and then the British Tommy comes and is appalled by what he sees, and that's the kind of propaganda that we're looking at. Like,
all we have to do is paint something heroic to appeal to the simple-minded Tommy. Over to you, Baldric. How about a noble Tommy standing with a look of horror and disgust over the body of a murdered nun what's been brutally done over by a nasty old German?
And like these stories of atrocities, like huge stories, and there would be pamphlets which explain. So I'm looking at one now. This story was told by Harry Lauder to the Montreal Canadian Club that was given to him by his son Captain Lauder, who gave his life for his country. The Germans had captured 6 men of the Black Watch. They stripped them naked, made them stand at attention through the cold night, and at dawn said, "You swine, get back to your trenches." Then, as helpless, frozen and naked men, they stumbled over no man's land, and they were mowed down by machine guns. This is culture, and culture is in German. And there's like just tons of these stories of what the Germans do when they catch people, what the Germans do to civilians, what the Germans do to bayoneting babies and, raping nuns. And they are not subtle. They're monstrous, and part of this derives from we do have a clash of cultures in that Germany was not a democracy at this time. It was a monarchy. The king technically was in charge of all decision making as advised by his cabinet, which was led by the Chancellor, and they don't really have any form of democracy. And whereas in Britain we had really just about discovered it, Britain has a very, by that time, a very entrenched view of constitutional monarchy, where the monarch just is a figurehead, and France had only not that long ago had its revolution, and they were at the time very invested in the idea of democracy and of people voting and of not being led around by kings and things like that. So there is this cultural clash between them. While obviously the Germans thought that portray the British as being decadent and stupid, relying on mob rule rather than personal brilliance. Once again, there are people who've dedicated their entire careers to not boiling it down to as simple as that. But
well, that's great for them.
But they're not sexy, and we are.
But this is where we also get the Bryce Commission, which was put in place to ostensibly investigate how the Germans really were treating people. But after the war came under a lot of criticism for essentially being a load of shit.
Yeah.
Having not aggressively enough interrogated the situations they were looking into and not being a reliable source of information. But at the time when it came out, it was very much seen as an official document that backs up the propaganda that people were being inundated with, that the German soldiers were doing horrible things to these innocent Belgians.
It's a bit like the sexed up dossier of 2003 of the early 20th century. It's the weapons of mass destruction of its time.
Yeah.
To make a cultural reference that is both timely and and relevant. Yes, and in the notes that I'm looking at, Janina has just written, "What the fuck is up with the Bryce inquiry?"
Yeah,
Which is
interesting
fair.
is that the Bryce Commission, it seems to have been something that's continued to be debated throughout the last 100 years, to the point where when I looked up the Wikipedia page for it, it was like, oh, this page has just been recently edited by someone who was full on everything in the Bryce Commission was true and accurate and detailed, and that we shouldn't have criticised it at all, which I thought was hilarious.
See, this is a fun thing about this stuff, is that there are still people debating these issues.
And obviously we can't we can't aggressively look at how accurate it was now because all the people are dead. We can't re-interview them. So it's looking at the historiography of it rather than the actual event itself. But, you know, most of the time in the years following, people were highly skeptical about its accuracy.
Yes. And in the context of the nationalist fervour that was being... And that nationalist fervour was incredibly effective. Like, I live in Northern Ireland. I live in a very loyalist working class area, which was the area where the Ulster Volunteer Force, which later in the 1970s became a paramilitary group, but began life as a force which came together to go and fight together in World War One, and to fight for British values, and to fight, you know, in what they believed for completely voluntarily before conscription, what they believed was the right thing to be fighting for, and to protect Britain from these semi-imaginary threats. And as a result, on my walk to work every day, I walk what is called the Poppy Trail now, which is because it has been somewhat manipulated by more modern nationalist interests. But there is a list of every single man that died at the Somme, and it is huge. It's a mural that takes up a wall. There are hundreds of names on it, and these people were taken into, and this is something I think that I struggled with. And one of the reasons why I find all of that stuff about treaties and then Germany did this and then... So there are no people in these conversations. It's just countries, as if countries have a life of their own.
Right.
And then Britain did this, and then Belgium did this, and there are people at the front of that.
Yeah, and making those decisions on behalf of everyone else in the country. And
then 20 million people died in World War One.
Yeah.
It was such a cultural shock that we still use language from it today to talk about stuff. Like, we still say we're shell-shocked by things because so many people came back suffering from the horrors of what they had experienced, that entered cultural parlance as a way of talking about being horrified.
Well, yeah, and this is an interesting thing that, like, not only is it these arbitrary people behind the names of Britain and France and Germany and what have you, it's people who are still, like we said earlier, sort of staging a war with old-fashioned tactics, completely unaware of what that means for the soldiers on the ground, which is being under fire of shrapnel constantly. It means having mustard gas being poured at you all the time. It means suffering from trench foot because you've had to suddenly dig a hole in the ground to escape the artillery fire that no one expected to be as devastating as it was. So the ramifications on a personal level for the men on the ground is just so staggeringly out of the realm of the consciousness of the men making the decisions about whether or not we kept fighting. Yeah, and it's astonishing reading about it, how many points it feels like so many books will say, except at this point nobody was ready for peace, and you just think, who wasn't ready for peace? I'm pretty sure a lot of people were ready for peace. Like, just apparently the issues being debated were so much bigger than people in a way that had almost never existed before. Yeah. That people get really lost in the way that people write and talk about World War One. Yeah, because this is the thing about it that makes it so significant, is that we know so much more about the personal impact of World War One than we do about any wars that went before, partly because it was more recent and record keeping was better, and there are newspapers and things, but because there's a lot going on. There's how the war actually was when you were faced with it. There is the fact that despite whether or not you were conscripted or whether you volunteered, you had been inundated with this aggressive campaign of how Britain and America and all of the allies were strong, stalwart, true, right, just people wading in to help this innocent Belgium, who was often personified as like a beautiful woman wearing white in distress in the propaganda, against an inherently evil army. Most of the men were really young and hadn't had a military experience before this, and then got there to this brutal battleground. Whenever they did come across soldiers from the other lines, they found men as young and as scared and as emotionally uninvested as they were themselves. They found a mirror image of themselves on enemy lines. Yeah. which then, of course, after the war led into pretty much worldwide disillusionment, which is where we get, the existentialist art movements and Dadaism of the 20s and 30s is where we get, decline and fall.
Yes. It's where you get I, Claudius, interestingly. Because Robert Graves was one of those many, many writers that was on the front lines and experienced those things. And that's where you get all of that World War I poetry that we all read. And all of those terrible... It's interesting because I read a book called Remembering War, The Great War Between History and Memory in the 20th Century by Jay Winter, which is about the idea of memory in the 20th and 21st century and about how that almost began with the First World War. It was so horrific, produced so much in the way of material culture and written culture that it kind of invented the idea of remembering as a form of respect, that you are, by remembering things have to be remembered is a way to respect them, and that's how you end up with things like Armistice Day and all the rest of it.
Yeah, so we're still kind of in the middle of propaganda. We waited off there for a while.
We did, but propaganda was massive. And then the biggest propaganda move of all time, the Lusitania, which brought the Americans into the war, and which is one of those things which I had always, it's so successful as a campaign that until extremely recently I did believe that it was the sinking of an innocent ship.
Yeah.
And that it was an evil German act to bomb the Americans, basically.
Yeah, they found just a random passenger vessel.
Yeah, and just picked on it. But in the way that, it was the Pearl Harbor of World War I. And that is very much because that's how it was portrayed, and unbelievably effectively portrayed as being these innocents, and a lot of innocents died in it. But it is now conclusively proved, as far as I'm aware, that it was carrying military weapons, that the US was using civilian ships to transport weaponry where they were absolutely not allowed to, and it was trespassing into places where they had definitely promised that they would not go.
Yeah.
And
they hadn't told, my understanding is they hadn't told the British that or in this particular case, they had not disclosed to the British that there were weapons on this ship.
Yes, and the Germans warned them and were like, can you not do that, actually? We are in a period of war and we will have to use wartime tactics. And they're like, hear what you're saying, but gonna keep going? Yeah, and as a propaganda tool, though, that is so... They highlighted the deaths of civilians. They massively highlighted the fact that they were not technically involved in the war. And the British took huge advantage of it as well. And, look how evil the Germans are, that they were just attacking random civilian ships. And it's not until decades later, the truth was known long before I was born. And yet still I grew up with this idea that the Lusitania was a war crime.
Yeah.
When, it obviously was going to put it as a non-ideal box.
Yeah.
Rather than the war crime box.
There's no good guys necessarily in this situation, but definitely wasn't an attack out of nowhere on a purely passenger vehicle, which is what it often is spoken about as. It is interesting as well that even then, it did take a couple of years for the US to join the war after the Lusitania was sunk, because they Woodrow Wilson faffed around for a bit.
Well, he really didn't want to get involved, which is fair.
Which is fair, it was horrible.
I can totally see why you would be looking at it up to, because when's the Somme, 1916, and watching those things happen and just go, probably all right, actually.
Yeah.
And it is a very...
Not for me.
Yeah, and it is a very... Because it is a European war. If it wasn't for the fact that so much of Europe now militarily dominated the world as a result of the imperialist project of the past couple of centuries, then it would have been one of the many European battles over who gets to own what bit of land that have been going on since 1066.
Yeah.
That's what Europe does. It battles over who owns what. It's what happens. Because it's not very big, but there's a lot of people. And if it wasn't for the combination of nationalism, military technology, and imperialism, that's what it would have been. But those three things perfectly coming together mean that it ends up, 1, covering the whole world, 2, killing a lot of people and getting nowhere, and 3, being about something related to identity, which had never happened
Yes.
before. Which meant that nobody was ready for peace at like 6 different times, when otherwise they would have been totally ready for peace. And certainly the Americans would never have been getting involved in a war happening thousands of miles away.
Yeah, that didn't really involve
or
anything
affect
to do with them.
If it wasn't for what was the beginnings of globalized trade, which come from, it was affecting their trade stuff. It was affecting their people who were traveling around the world, who was affecting their civilians, and it was beginning to affect them in a way that no other war ever would have, which is what makes it a world war instead of just a tedious European scuffle like the Napoleonic Wars. Sorry, Napoleonic people. But nobody's like, oh, I wonder what the Napoleonic Wars were about, because we all know what the Napoleonic Wars were about. They were about France wanting to own a bit more stuff.
Yeah.
And nobody wonders, what was 1066 all about? Wonder what was happening there. It was about France wanting to own more stuff. This makes it sound like the French were the bad guys previously. But it's not like every other country wasn't getting involved in starting wars. And that's what it otherwise would have been. It would have been like, oh, Germany wants a bit more stuff. But it became about other things, and then it rippled to affect other people in a way that is brand new and really frightening.
Yeah.
Because it's so hard, and I can't imagine how frightening it must have been. And I really do recommend to everybody Stefan Zweig's World of Yesterday, because he is one of these extremely liberal European intelligentsia who fundamentally sees himself as a European, and he writes this amazing bit about the introduction of passports and how he thinks they're fundamentally dehumanizing, because he just thinks that the concept of borders is so ridiculous. He's so eloquent in the way that he writes about his growing up in Vienna and about his experiences as a writer traveling around Europe, and he meets a load of great people, and then I hung out with James Joyce. But he is so confused when he writes about the beginning of war. So he wrote it in the late 30s, his memoir, and then killed himself in the early 1940s with his wife, because he saw World War II as being the triumph of fascism, and he couldn't see a way in which fascism didn't win, essentially. So he killed himself.
I mean, maybe he was right. What was like now?
Yeah, I read World of Yesterday just prior to the Brexit vote. At the time, I was thinking he'd probably really enjoy the European Union. He would think it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. Being able to cross borders, with ease, and being able to work collaboratively with people, and being able to see oneself as a European rather than being a member of a nation. But then Brexit happened 3 months later. I was like, oh, maybe not. But he is so baffled by what happens, and he literally just says, if today, thinking it over calmly, we wonder why European went to war in 1914, there is not one sensible reason to be found, not even any real occasion for a war. I can explain it only by thinking that the excess of power, by seeing that it is a tragic consequence of internal dynamism that has built up during 40 years of peace and now demanded a release. Every state suddenly felt that it was strong and forgot that other states felt exactly the same. Yeah, but he's just kind of baffled by it, and he lived through it, and it just must have been so frightening and so out of the blue. And to have, in the same way that I'm going back to Iraq here, but I distinctly remember in 2002 when all of that weapons of mass destruction started, and everyone started banging on about Saddam Hussein for the first time since the 90s. I distinctly remember being with my boyfriend at the time, being like, do you understand what's happening? Why are we suddenly... He's been the same since I was in primary school. And do you understand why we're talking about this? And him going, no. And we were just completely confused about what was happening, and the more news we read about the situation, the less we understood it. And I feel like the beginning of World War I must have felt the same to everybody. Do you know why we're going to war? No, I haven't got it. Oh, the Germans are the bad guys. Okay, right.
Yeah, it is a very impressive thing how quickly and comprehensively it became an idealistic war.
Yeah.
When it was not that at all on any level.
Yeah, and there's nothing in the beginnings of it that can call it, even as a nationalistic war, it's not really.
No.
It's just confusing. But it forms national identities And you know, we still, as an English person, you still feel that poppies are such a massive part of national identity to a certain extent, of celebrating our boys. And
completely. And there's even still a pressure, I think, to celebrate them as men who and women who died
for their country,
for a cause, for their country, for something that is noble and worthwhile, when they absolutely did not. They were sent to slaughter for the sake of a tiny invasion.
Yeah, for such complicated reasons.
For complicated and baffling and just irrational reasons, it feels like.
Yeah, it's just so big, I think. But then this is another thing, which is that we also have this tendency to see World War II as though it were that, when really World War II started in exactly the same way. It starts with Germany crossing a border that they weren't allowed to cross.
And after they had sort of got themselves a reputation as a country that would do that and that would fight a brutal war for the sake of it.
Yeah, and you know, half the reason why you get that whole appeasement stuff with Czechoslovakia is that World War I had upset everybody so much that they didn't want to do it again.
Yeah,
but
understandable.
Yeah, but you know, the reason that World War I started was that Germany invaded Belgium because of a series of complicated alliances, and then everybody was in. And the reason that World War II started was that Germany invaded Poland, and because of a series of complicated alliances, everybody was in. And then later, afterwards, we found out the true extent of everything that Nazism entailed.
Yeah.
And it's not like a lot of that, you know, the beginning stuff in the run-up was not a huge secret to anybody, but the extent of it and the concentration camps were something that changed the flavour of what World War II was.
Yeah, and it is, like, I mean, it's a topic for another time, but it is an interesting thing where anti-Semitism was as rife everywhere else as it was in Germany.
Yes.
And it was really the discovery of what the Nazis were doing that led to that being a signifier of evil intent as well. Sorry, I stumbled over that.
But yeah, it is because of what we found out at the end of the war, that colours all memory of the Second World War. And then because the First World War has what seems to be similar goodies and baddies.
Parallels.
Yeah, it has... You know, it is us versus it's Britain and France against the Germans.
Yeah, and there is a lot. There's a lot of direct connection as well, in that, like, the reason Britain started gently nudging towards the idea of war was that Germany was breaking its treaty agreement. Like, it was rearming itself when it had promised not to, which doesn't look great when you've just been the aggressor in a major war.
But then we're back to nationalism and national pride.
We are. It's exactly
and that
right.
idea that they had been deliberately humiliated. But then now we're into World War II, and we're not here to talk about World War II. It's a topic for another day. But it is very hard, I think, to look at from the perspective of being non-experts and from the perspective of lay people dealing with cultural representations and pop cultural representations of World War I and II, to look at it without being influenced by World War II, see what World War I actually is.
And it is important because it's how it has such an impact on what is happening in our country today.
Yeah.
Well, in my
Your
adopted country. Because that nationalist pride that started with this propaganda was kind of weaponized, shall we say, by this propaganda. That nationalist pride is what has led to things like the Brexit vote.
Yeah.
You know, it's what has led to the rise in right-wing thinking today. And it's all founded on this flimsy base, both here and in the States, and we're used to thinking of ourselves as the good guys in this inherently black and white, good versus evil couple of wars, and that's just not the case at all.
No, and that blurs then how you can understand how they began, because you think there has to be some kind of bad guy incident. Mm-hmm. It doesn't help, I don't think, having a lot of superhero films and things which are, and this is the bad guy, and they dress in black, and they have a long flowing cape, and they say, ah ha 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 ha, I shall destroy the world. And this is the good guy, and he has long flowing hair. And he will say, no, we shall defend the innocent. And
Which is an interesting state of affairs in and of itself, because the very first comic books were written by Jewish men living in America in the 40s. Rise of the North, in the 30s and 40s, and who were desperately trying to feel like there were good guys that were going to fight the bad guys because of what was happening to them in Europe. And that's significant as well. But there should be more room to explore the fact that not all good guys are good, and not all bad guys are bad. There is no good and evil. There is
not in World War One. No
conflicting goals and ideals in that.
Yeah, this isn't talking about innocence being crushed under the heel of a single oppressor. This is talking
a clusterfuck.
It's a clusterfuck. Yeah, it is. And
the thing is, it is something that seeps into pop culture a lot. Like I promised you that I would talk about the origin story of Hercule Poirot.
You did promise me you would tell me about Poirot. And if you don't, then I'm just going to make you do it at the end. So.
Well, I'm gonna do it now, because I do think that it's relevant. I think it's a relevant example of this passing of wars via the media of pop culture that then retroactively influences how we see them. Because the first appearance of Hercule Poirot is in The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie. If you didn't know Poirot was Agatha Christie, he is.
He is a Belgian detective, an ex-policeman from Belgium, who then spends his retirement kind of pootling around the world, and a lot in England, but also like hanging around in Egypt, and pootling around on the Orient Express, and getting on trains in Iraq, and solving murders.
Solving lots of murders. But the first one, it's a very war book, Mysterious Affair at Styles. So its main character and narrator is Captain Hastings, who has come home from the war with an injury. He's got a very John Watson-like limp, and he's living in this small town, visiting a friend of his who lives in like the town's big manor house, where like the daughter of that house is working in a dispensary, because that's a thing that young women did during the war, that they became chemists, including Agatha Christie actually, which is where she learned so much about poisons.
She knows so much, like a lot about poison.
But in this village at the time, there is a group of Belgian refugees, and the whole village treats them with such pity, because they've fled the horrors of being so persecuted and brutalized by big bad German soldiers. And one of the Belgian refugees is Hercule Poirot, who Hastings just stumbles across, and there is a murder, and it's a murder mystery. But that is his origin, is a refugee from this war where his country was the victim, Germany was the villain, and Britain were the heroes.
Yeah, and they're protecting
the dynamic that he starts with.
Pathetic, like, can't look after themselves refugees who are all living in little hotels in small English villages.
In small English villages.
So what's our conclusion? What was World War One all about? It was about a lot. Yeah,
it was about a lot, but mainly no one had settled on who should own which bit of Europe to everyone's satisfaction.
Yeah, and I feel like though we still don't. Again, I live in Northern Ireland, and there's an ongoing discussion about who owns this particular bit of Europe that I live on. Like this, who specifically out of two countries owns the house that I live in. In the end, I'm just going to go back to Stefan Zweig again, because I just want everybody to read this wonderful book. And in the end, I feel like every state suddenly felt that it was strong and forgot that other states felt exactly the same after what was comparatively an enormous amount of peace in Europe. The 40 years of nobody invading anybody was a very long time.
It's too much to deal with. It's like having a pimple building up under your skin.
Exactly. Or like when you've, I don't know, not had some cheese for a really long time, and it gets to the point where you're just dreaming about cheese.
So World War One, just someone binging on cheese.
Someone binging on cheese, except cheese is the slaughter of 20 million people.
Yeah.
So it's not my best analogy.
No, but it's what we've got. We work with what we have.
It's what I've ended up with.
What we have is cheese.
I don't even have your excuse of not having slept properly.
So at the end of the day, we have a war that was about borders and colonialism and a display, wanting to have a display of strength and be in charge of who had what, and in the end became about manipulating nationalism and painting everything with very broad strokes and in very specific lights to the detriment of all.
Yeah, and everyone lost, really.
Everyone lost.
There were no. This is another other thing about World War One. Then there was no great victory. It's just everybody was so. This is why it ends up being an armistice. It's not like a victory, a parade across anything. It just is a.
We can't do this anymore.
We have finally reached the point where we are ready for peace. And
it set the stage for another war to start a couple of decades down the line. So it really was the least victorious war that there has ever been.
Although I did read
I don't know that to be true. That's it.
I did read one book which is titled A Perfidious Distortion of History, which is an absolutely brilliant title for a book, which his main argument is that. So the argument for that World War One started World War Two is that the Versailles Treaty so abused Germany by putting such enormous sanctions on them that they had, it was almost inevitable that they would eventually have to fight back.
It was like an economic curse, really.
Yeah, and and such things as hyperinflation and the extreme restrictions that were placed on them, with such as not being allowed to have any kind of military, were so enormous that it was almost inevitable that their pride would be so bruised that they would have to put on some kind of display, and thus World War II. Yeah, and the argument is that that's nonsense, and that it is indeed a perfidious distortion of history.
Well, this is the thing. All history is distorted because it was all written with an agenda.
It was all written with an agenda. That's also good if I know it.
Yeah.
This is the great thing about being a historian, is that it's an unsolvable puzzle that has no answers, so you can just keep going forever. There will never be a point where you go, well, that's history finished. We've done it all, lads. We've done it all.
So what you're saying is we've committed to this podcast, so we can never die.
We can never die. We're going to have to be 98 and doing it in our home. By that time, we'll be like holograms or something, or we'll have been uploaded into the machine, like in an X-Files episode. And no one will actually
listen to podcasts. The information will just be planted in your brain.
Yeah, or it will come in through like contact lenses, like so you have like a screen on at all time or something.
I don't. We need to stop. I've already seen too many episodes of Black Mirror.
Oh, really?
In my life.
I just read a lot of science fiction books, and they're really into putting contact lenses in eyes for some reason that then have like any kind of, you control the computer with your eye movements.
I mean, I wore contact lenses for a decade. That does not sound worth it.
No, I don't wear contact lenses. One, because my face looks weird without glasses on, and two, because sometimes you fall asleep with them in and it really hurts.
It really, really hurts. I used to have to do plays under hot stage lights with contact lenses in. That really hurts too.
I can imagine. I eventually stopped wearing them when I got drunk and tried to remove a contact lens I did not have in. And it was about 40 minutes of just trying to essentially pull off my own cornea. It's very painful.
Yeah, that's no good.
Don't drink in contact lens. Okay, so that's World War One. Complicated. Hopefully we've made it unboring, though. I don't know that we made it sexy. Unless you find, like, the idea of hulking Huns over dead bodies particularly sexy. Or, like, evil propagandists, I'm not sure.
I mean, we've been on the internet. We know there's a kink for everything.
There is 100% a Rule 34 for this somehow, yeah. And next time... So this is what we wanted to do, really, which is have other people ask us questions. And these first two, we've asked our own questions of just ones that interest us. But we have our first listener question, which is from a friend of ours called Tim, who has a good beard and some good dogs.
He does have a good beard and some good dogs. Well done, Tim.
Yeah, and a good wife, too.
Excellent wife.
And he sent us our first question, which was... Before Scott and Charlene tied the knot in 1987, did anyone marry for love?
I mean, I had to Google who Scott and Charlene were.
What? You're the antipodean amongst us. I was relying on you for episode 3 to explain this. Okay, well, I will be explaining
You'll be explaining Scott and Charlene.
Don't Google it before episode 3 because we will explain who they are. So we're going to be talking about the history of marrying for love, which is great because I'm almost an expert on that again. So yeah. I'll be doing less, I don't know, the Germans or something.
But I will be doing the same amount of that because I'm an expert in nothing.
Not even neighbours, Jesus Christ.
Not even neighbours. If you want to ask us a question, you can tweet us.
You can.
At sexyhistorypod.
Yes, or you can email us now at sexyhistorypod@gmail.com. Or you can tweet me at nucleart.
And you can tweet me at J9 and if.
There you go. And yeah, episode 3 in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's all the things we have to say.
That's all the things we have to say. And let's listen to
World War
Janina's.
I? It turns out a clusterfuck was the deal with World War I.
Complicated, man.
Yeah.
Complicated. All right. Bye, Janina.
Bye, Emma.